Good morning and welcome to the Naval Historical Foundation's second Saturday for November 2020. I'm former Navy Secretary John Leeman and Foundation Director. This morning's program is pretty exciting. It's focusing on the younger Teddy Roosevelt and the book that he wrote as a master's thesis first and then expanded, called The Naval War of 1812. What is amazing is not that just that this was his first of 40 books, but it remains today the authoritative book on the War of 1812, including in the United Kingdom. So it was the harbinger of great accomplishments to follow. TR has always been an inspiration to me. He overcame very poor health. He worked hard at it to build his body and his mental intellectual discipline. And he was really a fine author. When he was governor of New York, he was exhausted. He took a month off and wrote a 400-page book for relaxation, which is still in print. And he was a unique person. He had a great feel and compassion for people. He connected with people. He had an amazing history as police commissioner in New York, and then governor, and then the number 2 naval leader as assistant secretary of the Navy. There was only one at the time, so he combined all the assistants and the undersecretary, and left after 18 months to organize a cavalry unit to go and fight in the Spanish-American War, in which he led a famous assault on San Juan Hill and was a great combat leader. And then he came back, of course, to greater fame. And when President McKinley was assassinated, or before that, he was elected on the ticket with McKinley as vice president. And when McKinley was assassinated, he became the president and was reelected. And in the meantime, continued to write books and lead the intellectual debates of the day. So. This is going to be a great session this morning, and now I'll turn it over to our Executive Director, Rear Admiral Sonny Masso. Sonny?
Thank you, Dr. Leeman, for that overview of our 26th president and for teeing off this month's second Saturday, which features the aforementioned Theodore Roosevelt and his noted work, The Naval War of 1812. I never want to miss an opportunity to formally congratulate Secretary Leeman on being recently named the namesake for Guided Missile Destroyer 137, the USS John F. Leeman. This morning, we have assembled a stellar group of scholars who will share their thoughts about TR and his book in a forum moderated by Dr. Bill Leeman. Bill is ideally suited for this role as an associate professor of history, director of the Pell Honors Program, and a faculty fellow of the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. After earning his Bachelor of Arts degree from Providence College and his master's and PhD degrees from Boston University, he taught American history at the United States Military Academy from 2009 to 2011. We won't hold that against him because, ironically, while teaching at West Point, he completed his finishing touches on his book, The Long Road to Annapolis, the founding of the Naval Academy and the emerging American Republic. Go figure. Now, as the co-editor of the Naval Institute's newest title, Forging the Trident, Theodore Roosevelt and the United States Navy, he has tapped some of our finest historians to lend new insights on one of our great navalist presidents. I'll let him explain. As always, we hope you enjoy the program, but more importantly, we hope you join our foundation. Please consider joining online today. You won't regret it. Over to you, Dr. Leeman. Enjoy.
Thank you, Secretary Leeman and Rear Admiral Masso, for your kind introductions. It's a happy coincidence that this webinar on Theodore Roosevelt's book, The Naval War of 1812, is taking place just before the publication of a new book about Theodore Roosevelt entitled Forging the Trident, Theodore Roosevelt and the United States Navy. The book is being published by Naval Institute Press and will be released tomorrow. I had the privilege of co-editing the book with Professor John Hattendorf of the Naval War College. The book's origins go back a few years. I first met John while attending the McMullen Naval History Symposium at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis in 2013. John and I actually met on the shuttle bus between the conference hotel and the Naval Academy. We both work in Newport, Rhode Island, and kept in touch over the years. A few years ago, I came across a book edited by Dr. Ed Marolda that examines Franklin D. Roosevelt's relationship with the U.S. Navy during his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and as President. And I immediately wondered if there was a similar book about Theodore Roosevelt. I did a quick library search and didn't find anything. And it struck me that this was a pretty significant gap in both the history of the U.S. Navy and the scholarship on Theodore Roosevelt. In the summer of 2016, I was having lunch with John and asked him if he knew of a book that looked at Theodore Roosevelt's lifelong relationship with the Navy, and he didn't know of one. So I asked him if he would be interested in co-editing a book that would fill that gap, and luckily for me, he agreed. Forging the Trident is a collection of essays by leading naval historians that examines Theodore Roosevelt's lifelong fascination with the Navy, from his childhood through his presidency. Each essay in the book examines a different aspect of Roosevelt's interaction with the Navy, with the central theme of Roosevelt using naval history and America's naval heritage as a way to gain public support for developing the U.S. Navy into a major sea power during his own lifetime. The first chapter of the book, by Sarah Goldberger, examines the beginning of Roosevelt's fascination with the Navy, going back to his childhood and the stories he would hear from his maternal uncle, Confederate naval officer James Bullock. The remainder of the chapter explores Theodore Roosevelt, his family's Confederate naval heritage, and his role in the politics of reconciliation. The book's second chapter is by Kevin D. McCranie, and it evaluates Roosevelt's work as a naval historian, focusing on his first book, The Naval War of 1812. The book's third chapter, by Edward J. Marolda, focuses on Roosevelt's time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 1897 to 1898. My own chapter examines Roosevelt's interest in improving naval education at both the U.S. Naval Academy and the U.S. Naval War College, and using education as a means of developing American sea power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The chapter by John Scott Logel is a study of Theodore Roosevelt's efforts in the area of naval personnel reform, focusing in particular on Roosevelt's work to secure the amalgamation of line officers and engineers within the Naval Officer Corps, as well as the idea of promotion by merit rather than strictly by seniority. The chapter by Matthew Oyos takes a detailed look at Roosevelt's support for technological innovation in the Navy, including improved battleship design and gunnery, the use of submarines, and Roosevelt's early support for naval aviation. The chapter by David Conan examines Roosevelt's relationship with two competing ideological factions within the Naval Officer Corps, one led by Alfred Thayer Mahan and one led by William S. Sims. The essay by Brandon Little looks at Roosevelt's interesting relationship with his 6 secretaries of the Navy, and essentially makes the argument that Roosevelt acted as his own Navy secretary over the course of his almost 8 years as president. The chapter by James R. Holmes examines Roosevelt's attempt he used the Great White Fleet as a form of deterrence against the Imperial Japanese Navy. The chapter by Jason W. Smith continues looking in greater detail at the Great White Fleet and studies how Roosevelt used history and heritage to inform his navalist policies, most notably through the voyage of the Great White Fleet. And then the book's final chapter is by naval historian Craig Simons, and it looks at Roosevelt's influence on his distant cousin and successor as president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, particularly focusing on how Theodore influenced Franklin's career and worldview. Since today's webinar is focused on Roosevelt's book, The Naval War of 1812, we're fortunate to have with us Dr. Kevin McCranie. Dr. McCranie is the Philip A. Crowl Professor of Comparative Strategy and the chair of the Department of Strategy and Policy at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Kevin has a PhD in military history from Florida State University, and he is the author of Admiral Lord Keith and the Naval War Against Napoleon, published by University Press of Florida in 2006. Utmost Gallantry, the U.S. and Royal Navies at Sea in the War of 1812, published by Naval Institute Press in 2011. And Mahan, Corbett, and the Foundations of Naval Strategic Thought, forthcoming in February from Naval Institute Press. So Kevin, can you tell us a little bit about Roosevelt's inspiration to research and write the Naval War of 1812? What was he trying to accomplish with this work?
Thank you. First, before I begin, the positions I am about to state are my own views and do not represent the Naval War College or the broader United States government. I think the place to begin this story is actually at Harvard. As Roosevelt later wrote, I thoroughly enjoyed Harvard, and I'm sure it did me good, but only in the general effect, for there was little in my actual studies which helped me in afterlife. Instead, he became sidetracked with naval history, where the frigate and sloop actions between the American and British Sea Tigers, as he said in 1812, were much more within my grasp. By the time he graduated in 1880, Roosevelt had completed 2 chapters of what became the Naval War of 1812. As a young man in his late teens and his early 20s, this is a considerable feat. And we have to figure out why. What led Roosevelt to start this process and continue it through to its end? And for that, we should look back to his family or his growing up, and particularly the influence of his mother. He later recalled, quote, "From my earliest recollection, I had been fed on tales from the sea about ships, and fighting ships, till they sank into the depths of my soul." The stories his mother told were often of his 2 uncles, Irving and James Bullock. Both served the Confederacy, and Roosevelt made their acquaintance, and particularly that of Jane later in life. And he even wrote in the acknowledgments of the Naval War of 1812 about James, without whose advice and sympathy this work would probably never have been written or even begun. Now, why the War of 1812 of all wars? What inspired him to write about this? This goes back to something that Bill said in the first part of the talk today. Roosevelt writes naval history not for history's sake, but he writes it to apply it to contemporary issues. And specifically, he's writing about using the War of 1812 as a tool to explain to people in his own day about the general importance of navies, and more specifically about naval preparedness and the necessity to have well-trained men and the best possible material. Now, to find a story, he needs to look to a war the United States has fought. And one choice is the American War of Independence, but that just doesn't work because there's no Navy at the start of it. He can't really look to the Civil War because it's only 15 years in the past and it's too controversial. The War of 1812 is rather perfect because the United States starts with a small Navy, very well trained, and acquits itself very well. But it's just not large enough. The Americans were prepared in some ways, but not in others. And it creates quite a way to build a story. Plus, Roosevelt realizes, particularly, I think, as he's writing the book and as he's researching for the book, that there is no full, accurate, as he says, unprejudiced history of the war that had ever been written. No single book can be quoted as to be accepted by the modern reader as doing justice to both sides or telling the whole story. He found the works by historians like James Fenimore Cooper and William James to be both partisan and replete with unsupported evidence. I will speak much more about how effective Roosevelt was in imparting his account of the war later in today's talk. But for right now, I'd like to pass this off to Scott Mobley to see how this book was received in the naval environment of the 1880s. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. So joining the discussion is Dr. Scott Mobley, a retired captain in the U.S. Navy. Dr. Mobley is the Associate Director for the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy and a lecturer in political science and history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and he earned his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Scott is the author of Progressives in Navy Blue, Maritime Strategy, American Empire, and the Transformation of U.S. Naval Identity, 1873 to 1898, published by Naval Institute Press in 2018. So Scott, the period you write about is a formative one in the history of the U.S. Navy, an era that saw a significant increase in the attention paid to the growth of American naval power among not just naval officers, but also politicians, the press, and the public. How do you see Roosevelt's book influencing American attitudes towards sea power during this period?
Thanks, Bill. Reflecting on the era in which Roosevelt's book appears, in 1882, the Navy's in the middle of a hugely transformational moment. The closing decades of the 19th century saw three critical lines of development basically conjuring change within the Navy. One would be strategic, another would be technological, and finally, the third relates to the Navy's mission. So speaking to the strategical first, during the 1870s and 1880s, an unprecedented professional discourse on strategy, tactics, and the history of naval warfare developed within the Naval Officer Corps. And as many people, maybe our listeners will know, the intellectual leader of that movement, who emerged from that movement, was Stephen Luce. There were dozens of officers involved during the 1870s and 1880s. Interestingly enough, Mahan was a relative latecomer to this strategical awakening. He had his own awakening moment around 1885 when he found out he was going to be heading to the Naval War College. So this strategical awakening led to institutionalizing strategic studies and strategic planning within the Navy in ways that it never had been before. Some of the markers of this institutionalization would be the founding of the Office of Naval Intelligence in 1882, the Naval War College in 1885, and then later on the General Board in 1900. So at the same time that strategy is changing and is being embraced as a professional skill, professional knowledge by the Navy Officer Corps, we're seeing a major technological makeover of the fleet itself. We're seeing the emergence of a modern battle fleet with modern high caliber rifle weapons, constructed of steel, powered by steam alone. Sails is basically fading away. So this modernization is part of the context for Roosevelt's, the appearance of Roosevelt's book. And finally, just as his book is starting to earn traction within the public and the Navy, there's a pretty dramatic change in the Navy's mission. In 1886, Secretary of Navy William C. Whitney basically announces to Congress that we need a Navy to fight wars. We need a battle fleet for this. The constabulary Navy that had been maintained by the United States for the previous century, and by that I mean a Navy that was designed to forward deploy for the mission of protecting and promoting American commerce, that becomes a secondary mission. So from 1886 on, we're looking at a Navy designed to fight wars. So right at this middle of this moment in 1882, Roosevelt's book appears. In terms of influence on attitudes within the Navy, it's kind of hard to pin that down. We don't know for sure how it may have influenced the thinking of naval officers, but we do know there are several touch points that suggest how the book may have influenced naval thinking. First, the War of 1812 is reviewed in both popular and professional journals like the Atlantic, like the Army and Navy Journal, and progressive naval officers, along with the public, read and contributed to these journals. Luce, who, as you recall, is the leader of the strategical awakening within the Navy, he knew TR personally, or Teddy Roosevelt personally, and told Roosevelt in 1888 that the War of 1812 must be our textbook for the Naval War College. And along with that came an invitation for Roosevelt to speak at the Naval War College. So in 1888, we see Roosevelt in the class of 1888 at the Naval War College. He comes in and speaks about the War of 1812. And in that audience is a number of progressive officers and others, people like Seton Schroeder, Charles Stockton, and Professor James R. Soley, who later became Assistant Secretary of the Navy. They're in that audience, and they're hearing what Roosevelt had to say. At the same time, the Navy purchases the book in volume, and a copy is placed in every wardroom of every ship in the fleet. So with these touch points, we can see how Roosevelt's book was disseminated, how it came into contact with many naval officers, and in particular the progressive officers that were leading the changes that typify these final decades of the 19th century.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Obviously, two of the giant figures in the development of American sea power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are Theodore Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan. So I was wondering how each of you would describe the relationship between those two men, between Roosevelt and Mahan. Kevin, you want to start us off?
Mahan and Roosevelt, one thing to think about is they're deeply aware of each other's works. Roosevelt reviews both the influence of sea power upon history and also the influence of sea power upon the French Revolution and Empire, Mahan's two critical first books. And you can see specifically in terms of Roosevelt's writing, when he writes a second large-scale work on the War of 1812. It's part of a 6-volume set by William Laird Close that looks at the naval history of Great Britain. And Close is the editor of it, and he pulls in people like Mahan and Roosevelt to write in their areas of specialty. And Roosevelt's second installment about the War of 1812 touches on issues like sea power. He doesn't really use the term, but he's talking about some of Mahan's same arguments that Mahan pushes out, that Roosevelt has, at least to a degree, internalized with his own writings. Thank you.
Okay, Scott?
In a lot of ways, we can look at Roosevelt and Mahan as kind of kindred spirits. And maybe there's a little bit of competition going on there as well. They're certainly following similar intellectual paths, looking at the same types of evidence. And as Kevin mentioned, they're reaching very similar conclusions. Scholars like Peter Carson and Michael Crawford have looked into this relationship and trying to understand how they influenced each other. In many ways, the book, The War of 1812, encompassed a tactical orientation that didn't align well with Mahan's orientation towards strategy and policy. But at the same time, when Mahan and Roosevelt developed this relationship, it centered on the War College, Naval War College first, but it continues. and they continue to trade ideas, and there's correspondence between the two. And eventually, Teddy Roosevelt becomes Mahan's patron and tries to influence things like the orders that Mahan's going to get from the Bureau of Navigation for his next duty station. And he very much mentor is a too strong a word, but a patron. He's looking out for Mahan and trying to influence him or exercise influence that will allow Mahan to continue his reading, his writing, his scholarship. Over time, as Roosevelt rises in authority and eventually becomes the president, he continuously reaches out to Mahan to tap into the latter's the respect and authority that Mahan enjoys in strategic circles internationally, naval matters, maritime matters, and he likes to use Mahan as kind of his expert when he's trying to make a case with Congress or with other political debates. So in the end, I would say that both TR and Mahans are very much fellow travelers, and they both participated in this strategic and historical dialogue that was launched in the 1870s and 1880s and continued into the 20th century. And they're both, in their own way, participating in that pretty much for the rest of their lives.
Great. Thank you both for your perspectives. Kevin's going to be joining us in our next segment. Scott, thank you for your insights on this critical period in U.S. naval history. We're joined again by Dr. Kevin McCranie of the Naval War College. Kevin, can you talk a bit about how Roosevelt's The Naval War of 1812 holds up as a work of naval scholarship over 130 years after it was written?
Thank you, Bill. I think you hit the first one key critical issue. It's over 130 years since it's been written, and we're still talking about it today. That's an indicator in the first place that at least something in it still resonates, and it still has held up well. But I think we need to be careful as we peel back the layers and realize just how it has held up in certain areas better perhaps than others. The first point is to think about the way that Roosevelt looks. He's a young historian when he writes this. He's in his early 20s when he gets it published. And frankly, he's a young historian compelled to prove his thesis. And his work has been described as combative, and it certainly is. And I would argue that he tries a bit too hard to discredit or at least to argue against previous historians of the conflict like William James and James Fenimore Cooper. In fact, his critiques are probably unnecessarily harsh at certain points. In terms of his research, I would argue that from the American side, his research is powerful, based on archival sources, and looks deep into the war. But he never gets to the British archives, and particularly in the latter stages of the conflict, his British sources really dry up on him, and he runs into major issues, at least trying to show the interaction between the American and the British navies. In terms of bias or how impartial he is, that's a much tougher question. Now, he goes to pains to argue that the rules cut both ways, that he tries to balance both sides off against each other, but then he goes on to say that, quote, the work should be written impartially, if only from the narrowest of motives, without abating a jot from one's devotion to his flag and country. Roosevelt makes it clear throughout the document, throughout the book, that he is a American patriotic nationalist looking at the United States in the process. In fact, he makes arguments like the 44s, referring to the Constitution and her like-minded frigates, were thus true frigates. That they were better than any other frigates was highly credible to our ingenuity and our national skill. He doesn't consider this bias. Instead, it's his patriotic lens. We shouldn't think of Roosevelt as anti-British in the book. Instead, he's just pro-American, I would say. And we also have to realize that we need to look at Roosevelt through the lens of the late 19th century, the 1880s in particular. and not the early 21st century. His contemporaries in reviews certainly noted that he has endeavored to make his history as impartial as possible. One specifically stated a very important point, I think, one of his contemporaries. It is entirely acceptable that authors should revel in, quote, the glories of one's own country, and by all means let every man stand firm for his people and his father's house. In other words, the standards of the 1880s are different. And by comparison to the writings of Cooper and James, Roosevelt is much more balanced in terms of looking at sources and trying to avoid saying things that are unsubstantiated or can't be substantiated. So in that part, his work is quite powerful. But I don't think he reaches the level of what we would consider impartiality to be here in 2020. I'd like to say briefly that his second book on the War of 1812, or the chapter in Close, Naval History of Great Britain, which is actually book length in terms of the chapter, is much more balanced than the first. Gone are the patriotic message in it. It's much more balanced between the British and the American side. He's less combative in it. You can tell he's a more mature writer and a more mature historian by this point. Many of his critiques of William James recede into the background, and as does the presentation. It gives a much more flowing narrative of the entire war. But on the other hand, it's not as well known as his first book. That first book that Theodore Roosevelt, the future president of the United States, wrote in but his early 20s. And thank you. This great question.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Joining the conversation is Dr. Michael Crawford. Dr. Crawford retired as the senior historian at the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command at the end of 2017 after a 35-year career as a Navy historian. For much of that career, he served as the head of the early history branch of the Naval Historical Center, the predecessor to the Naval History and Heritage Command. He earned his PhD in history from Boston University and is the author or editor of 19 books, including edited volumes in 2 major documentary series, Naval Documents of the American Revolution and the Naval War of 1812, a documentary history. Among his many awards, Dr. Crawford is the recipient of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award from the USS Constitution Museum Foundation and the Commodore Dudley W. Knox Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Naval History. So Mike, same question to you. How has Theodore Roosevelt's Naval War of 1812 held up over the past 130 years?
Well, thank you, Bill, for that nice introduction. The influence of Roosevelt's book, The Naval War of 1812, published first in 1882, has lasted down to today. It remains a standard study of the war and continues to be reprinted. And it still influences scholarship on the naval aspects of the War of 1812. And that's what I want to focus on, is how he continues to influence scholarship. Roosevelt says nothing about strategy, logistics, force structure, recruitment, administration, finance, or politics, all subjects of interest to modern naval historians. Roosevelt focuses solely on the tactics employed in individual naval engagements, and it is his approach to that subject wherein lies his influence. In analyzing naval actions, Roosevelt took a mathematical approach. He sought to determine the ratio between relative force and relative loss of the combatants and explain the outcome of each engagement in terms of that ratio. When the results of any naval combat were disproportionate to the differences in force, he then sought in the record evidence of differences in training, discipline, and courage of the crews, and the skill and judgment of the commanders. Contrary to some critics, his use of statistics was not formulaic. Rather, the statistics provided the basis for measuring the contribution made to victory and defeat of factors other than force, such as the maneuvers each commander ordered and the execution of their duties by the crews. The true measure of influence of Roosevelt's Naval War of 1812 on naval historiography is the frequency of instances in which authors doing original scholarship into naval engagements of the War of 1812 take Roosevelt's analyses into account. Such instances are numerous, and I will cite just a few. Take David Long, for instance. In his biography of William Bainbridge, he uses Roosevelt's method of determining the number of men who manned HMS Java during its encounter with USS Constitution and follows Roosevelt on the significance of that number. Similarly, in his life of James Biddle, Long concurs with Roosevelt that the contest between USS Wasp and HMS Frolic had been between equals, and that the triumph of the Americans had been won by their more effective tactics and more accurate gunnery. Similarly, Long agrees with Roosevelt on the causes of the USS Hornet's victory over HMS Penguin. Modern studies of the Battle of Lake Erie use methods and come to conclusions that parallel those found in Roosevelt's Naval War of 1812. In their study, HMS Detroit, the Battle for Lake Erie, Robert and Thomas Malcolmson, and in their study, A Signal Victory, the Lake Erie Campaign 1812 to 1813, David Skaggs and Gerald Altoff follow Roosevelt in analyzing the tactical imperatives imposed by the mix of long and short guns in the opposing fleets. And the authors of these two works, one set were Canadians and the other were Americans. So both of them are following Roosevelt. So what I want to point out is that these examples demonstrate the continuing relevance of Roosevelt's methods in studying naval combat history in the War of 1812. The questions that Roosevelt asked are still asked today, and today's answers are frequently quite similar to Roosevelt's. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. To follow up, can each of you talk for a little bit about how Roosevelt's book was received within naval circles on the other side of the Atlantic in Britain? Kevin, you want to get us started?
How was Roosevelt's book received in naval circles in Britain? I have not seen anything specific. His book is reviewed over there. He's certainly known over there. William Laird Clowes reaches out to Roosevelt to write the chapter on a naval history of Great Britain. And that's kind of shocking to many British that, in fact, Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan were asked to come across. Now, part of that we can see is that Roosevelt and Mahan are the two most well-respected and known naval historians across the Atlantic by the early 1890s. Roosevelt's really rests on this book here from 1882, the Naval War of 1812, and he is seen as really the leading authority on that book, on that war. Both Roosevelt's books on 1812, both the original and then his chapter that comes later on about the war, are reviewed very well in the British literature. And it's, although you get several snide comments like, well, we expected this from an American or thereabouts, in the end, there is a certain grudging respect, or even particularly by the second book, an acknowledgement that Roosevelt is an authority on this and gives at least a balanced appraisal in something that has a great deal of depth in it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Mike, same question to you.
Well, I think that Kevin has answered the question much more thoroughly and better than I can. I can say that more recent historians, naval historians in Great Britain, in my reading, seem to reflect the spirit of William James more than the spirit of Theodore Roosevelt.
Okay, well, thank you both for your insights on the significance and legacy of Roosevelt's book. I'll now turn it back over to Rear Admiral Masso for the question and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Leeman. for facilitating our panel of experts to discuss our 26th President's treatise on the Naval War of 1812 and its sustaining relevance to today, both historically and accurately. We are now at a time where you, our audience, participate with your own insights and questions. For this panel, we're joined by a dear friend of our foundation, Dr. and Commander Chris Renfro. Chris, call sign Jethro, is a 1989 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, where he spent 19 years as an operational naval flight officer before transitioning to the permanent military professor community in 2008. After 30 years of total service, he retired from the Navy in 2019 as an associate professor of history at the Academy. Last year, he joined the Naval History and Heritage Command as director of the National Museum of the United States Navy. He is joined on our live panel with Dr. Michael Crawford, Dr. Bill Leeman, and Dr. Kevin McCranie. Welcome, gentlemen. For the audience, please ask your questions via the Q&A link. Dr. Renfro, do you have any introductory comments on what you observed over the previous 30 minutes? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. I think that the one thing that I would just add to some of the comments that my colleagues have already made is, as somebody who teaches this stuff in an undergraduate setting, I find the publication of the book and the situation of the book in the late 19th century, in 1882, to be fascinating, both from the standpoint of this is a period of great change for the United States Navy, but it is also a period of great and very important change for the discipline of history as a profession. At the Academy, I taught for several years a course for sophomores who had just recently selected history as a major. And the point of the course was, well, number one, to teach them, how to write a paper that we would like and would grade appropriately, but also to teach them what it meant to be a historian and what history was as a profession and as a discipline. And the 1880s are right when the very heavy influence of the German schools of thinking are influencing American historians. And people like Ranke are saying things like, we need to tell history as it is. In other words, based on facts and on serious archival research. And of course, in 1882, we see Theodore Roosevelt doing this. So there's this shift going from the kind of great man patriotic storytelling that we might have associated with an early national period historian like George Bancroft to the more 20th century practice of the discipline of history, where we're asking important historical questions and then basing the arguments to answer those questions on archival research. And in Theodore Roosevelt's book, we get a little of both, right? So Roosevelt does, in fact, do a lot of very heavy archival research in the very same archives that all of us on this panel have spent so much time in. But at the same time, Roosevelt can't help himself. And really, I said before that Theodore Roosevelt at age 24 is no more able to keep his opinion to himself as Theodore Roosevelt at age 44 or 54, for that matter. And all throughout the book, we do see quite a bit of patriotic bias explained away one way or another. But at the same time, it harkens back to more of that early national patriotic storytelling. So the book I find to be a fascinating sort of the profession of history in transition. And were I to go back and teach the class again, I think I'd be tempted to assign the book and then have my students write me an essay on how they see the profession of history developing within the pages of Theodore Roosevelt's book. Thank you, Admiral.
Thank you very much. And kind of the next question really follows along, and it's kind of a double question. What are the perceptions of the historians in the United Kingdom about Roosevelt's treatments and conclusions, and were their views on the book in agreement with his assessments? Perhaps where did they differ? And then one of our viewers, Bob Cullen, asks, what were Roosevelt's greatest strengths as a writer, and where did he fall short? Over to anyone on the panel.
I'll take that one right here. looking at Roosevelt from across the water in Britain, the one thing we have to remember is during his lifetime, the British do not look in depth at the War of 1812. It's not the story they want to tell. There's a concurrent war that they're much more interested in, which is the Napoleonic Wars, with events like Trafalgar and Waterloo that are involved with it, that are great British victories. This war doesn't end with that great British victory, and thus you don't see a lot of emphasis among historians over there dealing with it. So Roosevelt pretty much has a fairly open field and not much competition when it comes to history, particularly coming from Britain over there. Plus, I think people in Britain, or at least people who follow the historical trends in Britain at the time of Roosevelt, notice that Roosevelt does some things well. And it goes back to what Chris Renthrow talked about. Roosevelt is making an attempt to make his writing, as they called it at the time, more scientific, that he is looking at the causes, he's looking at plurality of events and other things like that. And it really, really tracks with some of the things that the best naval writers are doing in Britain at the time. Thank you.
Who else? Any other thoughts?
Hello. I'd like to say something about Roosevelt's impartiality. Even though he was actually a nationalist and said a lot of nice things about the Navy and about how good our ships were and so forth in the War of 1812. He also attempted to display a certain partiality, and I'd just like to quote one section of the book in which he actually is praising a British officer. This is describing the death of William Manners, Captain of HMS Reindeer. Then the English captain, already mortally wounded, but with the indomitable courage that nothing but death could conquer, cheering and rallying his men, himself sprang, sword in hand, into the rigging to lead them on, and they followed him with a will. At that instant, a ball from the Wasp's maintop crashed through his skull, and still clenching in his right hand the sword he had shown he could wear so worthily, with his face to the foe, he fell back on his own deck dead, while above him yet floated the flag for which he had given his life. No Norse Viking slain over shield ever died better. This is high praise for the enemy, okay? And it also illustrates one of the attractions of Roosevelt's writing. It's not dry. It is very emotional, and this is one of the reasons why the book still continues to have resonance.
Yeah, just thank you very much for that, Dr. Crawford. Bob Cullen, his question, you really did touch on it. What were his greatest strengths as a writer, but more profoundly so to connect with Secretary Leeman's opening remarks. This was his first book. He would later write 40 books. And in fact, taking a month off to kind of recharge his batteries, he writes a 400-page book. So clearly his connection to the elucidation of beautiful language and homilies and metaphors and idioms, and that certainly ring true. Are there any other thoughts to just further drive home that point for Mr. Cullum? I'll take that as a no. So great. So the next question is how did a comparative analysis of the Roosevelt's Naval War of 1812 and then Alfred Thayer Mahan's influence of sea power upon history connect with one another to the war? How did TR describe it vis-a-vis how did Mahan describe it, and were they in violent agreement, or were there some subtle differences?
Roosevelt's book, The Naval War of 1812, is full of very technical detail. I mean, he studies each engagement between a British ship and an American ship in great technical detail. Whereas in Mahan's book on sea power with its relation to the War of 1812, Mahan takes a broader strategic view of the war as a whole. And this contrast between the two studies reflects the different approaches of the two scholars. Mahan wanted to train naval officers as generalists who could understand their specific mission, which within the broader strategic goals of the broader strategic context. And he didn't think that commanding officers needed to be technicians. And he therefore eschewed the kind of technical detail that you find in TR's book. So, and this contrast in outlook among naval thinkers continued throughout the 20th century, with technocrats like Hyman Rickover opposing others who wanted a more broad gauge liberal education for naval officers.
Any, Dr. Renfro, anything from you to add on that?
No, I would absolutely agree with Dr. Crawford. I think that Mahan's approach is definitely more strategic. And what we see in Roosevelt's War of 1812 is a very up close and tactical description of these battles, and not a lot of time spent on greater strategic questions.
Yeah, thank you. So there are a number of viewers that have been chatting and making some comments in that, and one who's a great influence to me was my first department head on my first ship in the Navy, Captain Bill Keating. And one of the things that Bill suggested was that if we get our announcement about the topic of the second Saturday out soon enough, then hopefully our viewers who are online today would have had an opportunity to buy and read the book. And of course, a number of us did that. And I think Pete Daly should be thanking us at the Naval Institute, because I give him a shout out frequently. And it's kind of the rock from which we build our historical church. But I had read this book as a younger man, and I reread it just literally in the last 3 weeks. And what I found about it, and I'm going to ask for your comments on it, it was very, in my mind, expository, because he began with his first paragraph, and he said, the War of 1812 occurred because of boom, 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 4 reasons, 1 paragraph, and then the whole rest of the book defends that. And then at the end of the conclusion, it's a reaffirmation of the topics or the causes that he said of the war. And of course, one of the direct causes of the war he expressed was disruption of United States commerce from the sea, as well as the British conscription of our sailors into their British Navy, were chief among them. Did these practices stop cold after the war? Did we achieve what we had expected, from the war at the end of the day? Any panelists, what are your thoughts?
I think I can speak to that one. We achieved the goals almost in spite of ourselves in this war. And what I mean by that is that in the peace treaty, Britain does not recognize that it will stop the search of commerce or stop the impressment of American seamen. Instead, what they do in reality is they stop doing it themselves, and they stop doing it voluntarily. The reason being is the Napoleonic Wars that precipitated the need for impressment and the needs for restrictions on commerce were over with, and Britain did not feel a need to have to continue those things in the period of peace, because they realized that it was frankly offensive to neutrals like the United States. What Roosevelt says is really interesting on this, in that he takes it and he says that Britain may not have recognized this in the peace treaty, but because of what our Navy did, and because of how effective the United States was, the British government realized after the war that they could not, or if they attempted to impose this on the Americans again, that the Americans would not roll over, that this gave the United States a certain deterrent effect in the future. And he makes that argument very strongly toward the end of the book.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCranie. A follow-on question from one of our viewers goes to the jingoism aspect, or the jingoistic aspect of TR's points about the American sailor was a better fighter than his counterpart, and that when they were impressed, like we just discussed, they really sort of phoned in their fighting. You know, that they really, even though we were a really young nation, their sense of either patriotism or personal pride or outrage at being impressed, or whatever those reasons are, that our fighting force, was top notch and theirs was third string. Any thoughts on that? Dr. Crawford?
The British had been fighting the French for a decade or two. And after Trafalgar, the French Navy was basically bottled up in port. So the British Navy had not a lot to do except to patrol along the shore and to make sure the French Navy didn't come out. So by the time of the War of 1812, which was 7 years later, the British Navy didn't have much fighting experience because of their success. And so they were, a lot of the officers were very complacent. I mean, the one exception is Captain Brooke, who commanded the Shannon and defeated the Chesapeake very handily, because he had focused on gunnery. But in the main, the British naval officers had not trained their sailors to be top notch, and this made a real difference in the fighting ability of the two sides.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I mean, one thought I had was the way Roosevelt tends to see naval power developing is that it's kind of a combination of two things. It's partly certainly technology based, so the quality of the ships that are being used by the Navy. But equally important, if not more important, is the development of naval personnel. In my chapter in the Forging the Trident book, I focus on Roosevelt's interest in naval officer education at the Naval Academy and the Naval War College, but he also felt the same way about the Navy's enlisted sailors as well. So Roosevelt sees it as kind of this two-pronged approach to building up American naval power. Yes, the ships are really important, but Roosevelt also realizes that the best ships in the world, the most technologically advanced ships in the world, are going to be useless if you don't have high-quality naval personnel commanding them and running those ships. So you can kind of see that when Roosevelt is examining the War of 1812 as a historian, he is giving attention to naval personnel because he sees that as the development of effective personnel as a huge part of building up American naval power in his own time period.
Thank you. You mentioned something that, and this is my question. I love this book. I loved it. And I'm so happy that I read it a second time. But President Roosevelt, as a 21-year-old, was just so exceptional. But, the purpose of our foundation is to view history as a springboard to informing, our Navy's present and future from studying the lessons of the past. And what TR said about this topic that many of you already this morning have touched on was our Navy's dominance in the war was because, and I quote, "It was highly to the credit of the United States that her frigates were of better make and armament than any others." it always speaks well of a nation's energy and capacity that any of her implements of warfare are of superior kind. This is a perfectly legitimate reason for pride. So I guess my question would be, how did this view inform maybe post-war shipbuilding and a policy focusing on a powerful Navy for our country in the mid-19th century? And fundamentally, you know, can we talk about the fact that we only had 28 frigates, right? And they had 600. So just how superior were we, and what are your thoughts, and how does it inform even our present today? Who wants to take that one? You want to start with that one, Dr. McCranie?
Oh, I certainly can. If you look at Roosevelt, Roosevelt's book, and as he writes about it, he's definitely making these arguments about the importance of Navy. And this goes right back to the previous statement. It's about the need for well-trained personnel and the best available ships. And it goes right to that quote of yours as well, that it should be a point of pride. And as Roosevelt's lifetime, or at least Roosevelt growing up, he looks at the United States Navy and what happens to it in the decade and a half or so after the Civil War, and he watches the Navy atrophy. It's not that the Navy's personnel are bad. It's not that they're poorly trained. In fact, he goes out of his way to say that the personnel of the Navy are better than or as good as they were at the time of the War of 1812. He just is worried that the Americans are not keeping up technologically with warship design. In fact, he goes on to write in one of his books on the War of 1812, it would be better for us currently today, and he's writing in the early 1880s, to scrap the entire United States Navy, take the money we saved, and build 6 really first-rate, high-tech, best top-of-the-line warships, and it could get us far more in the future. He's making these arguments that one needs a very technologically advanced, or the most technologically advanced warships possible, to marry those with the personnel. And we see that happening during Roosevelt, during the 1880s, into the 1890s, and then beyond in Roosevelt's presidency. I see this as a move, particularly as he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy and as president, perhaps culminating in his presidency with the Great White Fleet and that about. Thank you.
Other thoughts on that?
The Great White Fleet is a good exemplar of Roosevelt and his emphasis on technological superiority. Because when there was a call for the Atlantic Fleet to go to the Pacific because there was trouble with Japan, Roosevelt jumped on the chance and he said, yes, we'll send the Atlantic Fleet to California, even though the trouble with Japan was quickly pasted over. And the fleet went around South America to California and then continued around the world. And this was Roosevelt's idea. It wasn't the admiral's ideas. But a few years earlier, the Russian Navy had been at war with Japan and had traveled from the Atlantic to the Pacific, going the opposite direction. But by the time it got to Japan, it was in a horrible condition, and it was defeated at the Battle of Tsushima, which was a great shock to the Russians, and was not insignificant in leading to the revolution. But anyway, the Great White Fleet traveled around the world and landed back in the Newport News a year or so later in great condition. And this was, I mean, demonstrated that by the time of the Great White Fleet, our technology had been improved a great deal, and the ships were in great shape. And this is a lot to do to Roosevelt's leadership.
Great, thank you very much. Just to be sure that we've captured this appropriately, I want to go back to Dr. Leeman on the question that may have been compromised with audio discrepancies. From your book, Forging the Trident, what was President Roosevelt or TR at the time's view of John Paul Jones? Do you mind repeating that for us, please?
Yes, sure. Theodore Roosevelt really sort of becomes the, John Paul Jones sort of becomes the centerpiece of Theodore Roosevelt's efforts when he's president to really build up American naval power. And Roosevelt was someone who pretty much in every aspect of life had a strong sense of theatricality. He enjoyed military pageantry. He liked elaborate military ceremonies. And fortunately for him, his presidency coincided with the discovery in 1905 of John Paul Jones's remains in kind of a forgotten cemetery on the outskirts of Paris. And just backtracking a little bit, after the American Revolution, the American people had sort of frustrated John Paul Jones by not sharing his interest in building up American naval power at the end of the Revolutionary War. And in fact, the US government had sold off the remaining Navy ships. And so Jones kind of leaves the United States in a huff. His dream of being America's first admiral was dashed. And so he goes off looking for naval glory elsewhere, spends some time in the Russian Navy of Catherine the Great. And then Jones ends up dying in 1792, living in Paris, and dying kind of bitter and alone. And he ends up being buried in an unmarked grave in a Protestant cemetery on the outskirts of the city. And the grave is pretty much forgotten about by pretty much everybody for the next 100 years. Eventually, the person who really sets out to find Jones's remains is the U.S. ambassador to France, retired General Horace Porter. General Porter had been a veteran of the Union Army during the Civil War. He spent some time on the staff of General Ulysses S. Grant. And Porter was a great admirer of John Paul Jones, and he kind of made it his personal mission to locate Jones's grave with the ultimate goal of bringing Jones back to the United States and giving him a more proper burial befitting his past as a great American naval hero. So that ends up happening in the spring of 1905. Porter had actually begun an archaeological expedition on his own, initially using only his own funds. Theodore Roosevelt ends up getting additional funding from Congress to finish off that expedition. But Porter finds Jones's remains. They're positively identified. And that sets into motion for Theodore Roosevelt an opportunity to kind of have a historical spokesperson, if you will, for his vision of American naval power. Because in many ways, Theodore Roosevelt's vision of what the United States Navy should look like is very similar to what John Paul Jones hoped it would become way back in the 18th century. A large fleet composed of first-rate vessels, a highly professional officer corps. Roosevelt shares that in common with Jones. What's interesting, though, is that Roosevelt, as a naval historian, Roosevelt had kind of shared the common attitude that naval historians and many naval officers had of John Paul Jones throughout the 19th century, which was viewing John Paul Jones as kind of a rough around the edges, naval mercenary, kind of the swashbuckling figure in many ways, and not really viewing Jones as somebody who would be a great role model for America's professional naval officers in the late 19th and early 20th century. Roosevelt, at one point in one of his own writings, had actually kind of dismissed Jones as little more than a daring corsair, was the term that Roosevelt used to describe Jones. So Roosevelt will kind of reverse himself on that, and Roosevelt will be at the forefront of kind of this reimagining or reinterpretation of John Paul Jones, moving away from this kind of naval mercenary image that Jones had previously and de-emphasizing Jones's, I guess we could say, less than noble character traits, and instead focusing more on Jones as sort of being the prototypical professional officer for the United States Navy. And Jones uses Roosevelt uses the rediscovery of Jones's body to put on this elaborate military ceremony at the U.S. Naval Academy in April of 1906. Roosevelt had decided that really the only appropriate place to rebury John Paul Jones was on the grounds of the Naval Academy, which by this point had become the professional and cultural heart of the U.S. Navy. And so this ceremony takes place. Jones's body is brought to what today is referred to as Dahlgren Hall. Back then it was called the Armory at the Naval Academy. And Roosevelt gives this 30-minute address in which he basically presents John Paul Jones as the new patron saint of the United States Navy, the quintessential professional American naval officer. And Roosevelt very much presents Jones as a great professional role model for the midshipmen at the Naval Academy. And in a lot of ways, what Roosevelt is trying to do with Jones is to do for the U.S. Navy with John Paul Jones what Lord Nelson was to, and still is, to the Royal Navy. So this huge, larger-than-life, great naval hero for the country to take pride in, somebody who will inspire future generations of naval officers. So to a large extent, that's what Jones becomes through Roosevelt's efforts. It's sort of like the American Nelson. And even Jones's eventual burial in the crypt beneath the Naval Academy's new chapel, because this is the time when the Naval Academy's modern campus is being built. And so ultimately, Jones's remains end up in the crypt beneath the chapel, and it's kind of very reminiscent of Lord Nelson's burial beneath St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and that was certainly by design.
Well, thank you for that great answer and for doing it a couple times. From the Naval Academy class of 1969, which has just got some brilliant members, as all classes do, there's a gentleman named Gary Goodmanson who donated about 130 lucky bags, which is the Naval Academy end of yearbook. And I was perusing them all. I'm kind of addicted to this content. And in the class of 06, ironically, there were some notable graduates of that class who would have been there to see the dedication of this burial, including Admiral Isaac C. Kidd, who was kind of the father of a long lineage of really fine naval officers. Another one you might have heard of, James Sidney McCain, was in that class, as well as Aubrey Fitch and others. And I think in that class they had about 20 graduates who were namesakes of ships. So that's kind of that connection between some of our naval heroes and the one that that we all think of, John Paul Jones. This has really been a dynamite session, and I want to begin the wrap-up process. And what I'd like to do is go around, beginning with Dr. Renfro, and maybe have a 1 or 2 minute per person closure. So let's go to Jethro, to Dr. McCranie, to Dr. Crawford, and then we'll let Bill Leeman have the last word. Over to you, Jethro. Any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to share?
Yeah, when I teach the War of 1812, I spend a lot of time talking about the development of identity in the United States Navy, and you can argue about the strategic outcomes of the war, and at best it's essentially a draw, and Great Britain is tired of fighting and sort of goes home, and we don't gain a whole lot, I think, as has already been pointed out in the discussion. But what the United States Navy does gain is that there is never again a question about whether or not we're going to have a United States Navy. That is settled by the War of 1812. And the beginning of the development of the Navy's identity as a professional fighting force, I think, is very much cemented in the actions that took place in the War of 1812. And that's what I think you really see a lot of that come through in Theodore Roosevelt's treatment of the war.
Thank you.
First off, thank everybody here for being here today. I really enjoyed an opportunity to speak with you. For some parting thoughts, the big thing that hits me is just what Roosevelt accomplished with his books on the War of 1812. He's not writing history for its own sake. He's writing history as what we call applied history. He's using history to help us think about the present and into the future. And he's looking at the value of history in this regard. And I think that's extraordinarily important for us to think about how Roosevelt is able to use the War of 1812 to influence contemporary events and to make arguments for the type of Navy the United States should have, the use of the Navy, and the importance generally of having a well-trained Navy with first-class ships. The book, and I think that's this whole idea of the applied nature of it is one of the main reasons we're still talking about it today, that the message that he brings with this is so central in that regard. Thank you again.
Thank you. Dr. Crawford.
I think despite all the victories and hoopla about what the United States accomplished in the War of 1812, we have to remember we did not win the war. It was a British victory. The Canadians successfully prevented us from invading Canada, and the British did invade the Chesapeake and were able to run amok throughout the Chesapeake, burning tobacco and whatnot, and had a very successful blockade of the United States coast, and basically drove our ships off of the seas. And I think this kind of underscores both Roosevelt's and Mahan's point, is that despite the quality of our Navy, we were not prepared to win that war. We only had not 28 frigates, but 16 seagoing ships against the British 600 ship Navy. Anyway, I think it's important, even from a nationalist point of view, that we understand we did not win that war. Thank you.
Thank you for making that point, because that confuses me too. Dr. Leeman, your thoughts, sir.
Yeah, I think it's worth repeating. This echoes Kevin's comments a little bit, but it's worth repeating about how Theodore Roosevelt views history. So for Roosevelt, history is not just an academic discipline. It's not just an academic pursuit. I mean, that's not to say he doesn't see value in that. He does, but history is much more than that. So as Kevin pointed out, there's certainly this kind of applied nature to how Roosevelt does history. He does history as a way to learn lessons, valuable lessons from the past. And certainly we've talked a lot during this session about how Roosevelt did that. But I also see Roosevelt viewing history not just as a way to learn lessons from the past, but also as a way, I guess, to secure public support. So a way to excite the public about American naval power. So we talked a little bit about how the language Roosevelt uses in his Naval War of 1812, there's meant to be some excitement there, and how he describes the battle, how he describes the battles of the War of 1812. The example I talked about with John Paul Jones and all the pomp and ceremony associated with bringing Jones back to the United States, and the ceremony at the Naval Academy, that was a major press event that was covered all over the country. So Roosevelt not only sees history as a way to learn valuable lessons, but he also sees history as a means of exciting the public, as a means of inspiring people, promoting patriotism. And Roosevelt was a master of using history in that way during his presidency.
Gentlemen, thank you for your superb comments today and for your commitment to naval history. You honored us with your presence. Before we close, I'd like to ask you, the viewers, that you consider joining our foundation as an annual or lifetime member. This can be done instantly from our webpage, navyhistory.org. Each second Saturday presentation, we acquire more members, and we appreciate this support very much. Also consider, please, holiday gifts of memberships to your family and friends. I want to acknowledge the Rock Creek String Ensemble for their opening music to our webinar. Our foundation uses Jeff and his trio at most of our live events, and I think you know how entertaining they are. I got a lot of comments on their music. Hey, is that Bohemian Rhapsody or whatever the ones were? But nonetheless, thank you, Jeff, for your contribution there. We at the foundation wish you and your families a most happy and healthy Thanksgiving, especially under these unique circumstances with the pandemic. We're thankful for you, and we appreciate your support and enthusiasm for naval history. Thank you so much. God bless you all, and we'll see you next month. We've got an exciting program that I'll announce on Thursday Tidings coming up this week. Out here. Thank you.